Bruce Whitfield's Genius Podcast in partnership with Lexus. Subscribe now to catch new episodes dropping to your favorite podcast app.
Have you ever thrown a big party? One of those parties where people stay really late and it's an awesome evening. And then at home time, when they're gone at 2 a.m, all that's left is you.
No. Thank you for coming. Thanks for coming. Thank you for leaving. Bye-bye.
The crickets, perhaps a wayward cockroach.
Okay, bye.
And as the last person shuts the door behind them, you're left with the debris of everyone else's good time, while they go home to their clean spaces and go to bed without a clear up in the world to worry about. It's all up to you. Now, you can either carry on between 2 and 4 in whatever state you're in and put all your stuff away, but wouldn't it be nice to know that afternoon you'd anticipated that your so-called friends would be around to help you? Not, and you would simply get somebody to pop in at 10 the next morning and help you clean up. You'd taken out your phone, you'd opened an app and booked the services of a cleaner. Now you can go to bed without the dread of the task ahead of you. But first, back to the beginning. I need you to picture the scene. We're in San Francisco. It's 2014. There are not too many smartphones about, but they're beginning to get used in different ways to previous generation devices. Apps are becoming a thing. There's a young couple. They need a cab. They're told they can do it via an app on their phone. One of them, Swedish-born Alan Ribbick, is a tech junkie. He gets it immediately, downloads the app, hits a few buttons, and the car arrives. His wife, Aisha Pandor, who's got a PhD in human genetics and recently acquired business degree from the UCT Graduate School of Business, is with him.
We had to go somewhere and we weren't driving, he didn't have a car with him, and he hailed a Lyft cab, and this car shows up with a big pink moustache on it. And it was just the most incredible experience that through your phone, you're able to open up an app, get a stranger to come and pick you up, clearly identify what car the stranger's in, jump into the car without any worries, and they'll take you to where you need to go. And it was just such a seamless transaction. And that stayed in our minds. I think we, didn't really do much with it except for just being quite awestruck by the whole experience. And then we're thinking through our own business ideas and it came up again.
Aisha Pandor is descended from South Africa's political royalty. Her great-grandfather, Z.K. Matthews, was the catalyst of South Africa's Freedom Charter in 1953. Her grandfather, Joe, a political activist, and mother, Naledi, a senior government minister. Her formative years were spent in exile in Botswana, ahead of South Africa's transition to democracy. And when that happened, she grew up and was educated in Cape Town. Aisha, though, is taking a different path to her forebears, but with similar ideals, making people's lives better, or at least trying to do so. The difference now is that she is using business principles to achieve that outcome. Aisha, now back in San Francisco, has been looking at new markets for the idea, which came to her and husband Alan following that fateful cab ride that got them thinking differently about how to marry problems with solutions from business using cutting-edge technology. Out of that came SweepSouth, a platform designed to transform the dynamics of the domestic work sector, which has now morphed into a business on which you can list any service you can think of. This week, the trials and tribulations of trying to change the world. Here's a chat with Aisha Pandor.
We like the idea of marketplace businesses because there are two sides of a market that you're serving with a solution, and because they're difficult, which means that if you can build a product which solves a challenge well, it becomes really defensible, and ideally you can create this sort of viral flywheel that just helps the business grow on both sides. So we'd explored a couple of marketplace businesses, and then while we were busy doing research and sort of, coming up with business plans and that sort of thing, and, doing the lean canvas model to try and query our own ideas and interrogate them, our helper and nanny said that she was going to be going away on holiday. And that's where, trying to find a replacement, but then also that awesome experience with grabbing a lift ride came back up again. And we thought, let's build something that addresses this challenge that we've just had in finding someone that we trust who's available at the right time. We went eyes wide open into the industry, knew that this is, particularly in South Africa, but in the rest of the world, is an industry that has been plagued by centuries of challenges. And so it became, on the one hand, a great challenge to address from a business point of view, in the sense that, can you build a marketplace that in South Africa and other emerging markets helps to form these connections between two sides? But actually, at the same time, can you try and, through this technology, address some of the long-standing issues that exist, and do that over time, obviously, because you're not going to, in a couple of years or even a couple of decades, address centuries worth of issues.
You say issues and you say challenges. You're very diplomatic about it. I mean, this is an industry which is one of the most abusive on earth. You have people who are born into poverty and in many cases don't have an option but to go into household service, and they do so as a means to provide for a family. And often, if they end up in the wrong kind of family, they find themselves taken advantage of, and their poverty is taken advantage of, and they have very few options. And what you chose to do by creating, I'm going to call it the Uber-like platform, because most people will understand that concept, where people can work as much as they like or as little as they like, when they like, for whom they like, provided that they like the person's rating and they are happy with the offer on the table. Suddenly you democratize something as contentious as domestic work, and that is a bit of a revolution.
Yeah, I mean, you start to shift the balance of power a little bit more towards people who are doing the work. And I think, it then becomes, if I'm doing this work, and firstly, I just have more agency and more ownership around the work that I'm doing, but I can also say, I can dictate who I want to work with. If I'm someone who's rated highly, and, I'm in demand, I can start to pick and choose which jobs I go to and what suits what I want to earn and my lifestyle. And I think, importantly, you mentioned, just general choice and choice around making life decisions. And I think one of the most incredible and rewarding things that we've seen in how the platform has grown is how many people, and women in particular, who find work through the platform are saying, I'm taking the opportunity of this being a flexible platform to study or to, upskill myself in terms of doing other work, which might not be full-time, but which is going to give me work experience. And so we've got quite a high rate. I think the last time we checked, it was around 22-23% of people working through the platform who are studying or in other ways upskilling themselves. And I think that's, for me, one of the most tragic things about this industry, is that traditionally it's an industry where you get in, you're paid badly, there isn't much choice, and you don't really have much opportunity to leave and to have exposure to other types of work or an education which would allow you to move past this industry.
It's a poverty trap, and for many people in many respects. You then expanded it into other industries. You said, okay, hold on a second, but dog walkers, what about house sitters? What about people who are plumbers and got other skills and would like to also have access to similar flexible working conditions? And you created SweepSouth Connect, and that then broadened the scope and the reach of SweepSouth. You expanded the model into Kenya and into Nigeria, and that came with a set of complexities which we can touch on in just a moment. And then about 2 years ago, maybe more, I've lost track of time, you bought a slightly older tech business in Egypt called Fikhaldima, which you then... And it's just the most astonishing set of circumstances. And if you brought that all on board and digitized it and brought it into the mobile age from the desktop age.
Yeah, we did. And so I think one of the incredible things that Alan specifically did in sort of building SweepSouth, from the get-go, was building it in a way that it was agnostic to the type of service. I think we both knew that if we wanted to dedicate a big portion of our sort of working lives to building something, we wanted to build something that was able to be scalable and at least have the opportunity to address, reaching as many of these. And in South Africa, it's, we have 1 million domestic workers. And, when you extend that to other markets, it numbers in the tens of millions. And so it was thinking about, how do we, from the get-go, build this platform in a way that it's scalable. And we've had just phenomenal opportunity to grow that in terms of the services. It made sense to start off with the problem that we had. We were fortunate in that the problem we had meant that it was a repeatable business, so we were building relationship with both home service providers, domestic workers, cleaners, nannies, and customers on a long-term basis, and then could layer other services on top of that. And then, as you say, start once we'd gotten good product market fit and really understood the dynamics of the business well in the South African market, could start thinking about additional markets, either through organic growth or through the acquisition of a company like Whitfield, who has had phenomenal growth off of the back of that acquisition and the integration of not just the technology, but also just operations, how we do things at SweepSouth, the lessons that we've learned through scaling in the South African market, and then how some of that can be applied to Egypt, which is a huge market on its own as well.
What is the saying? Africa is not a country. These are vastly different economies, vastly different countries, vastly different cultural experiences in terms of the way in which people behave, the way in which currencies work, the way in which payment systems work. I think you've had several collective baptisms of fire in many respects in building these businesses. Just a quick view of some of the key differences as they sort of materialized and you moved into new markets.
Yeah, I think it's everything from your consumer base, the paying customers, and how they perceive these services and use these services outside of a platform like SweepSouth, and how do you market to them? So we've had a lot of growth in e-commerce and consuming online services and products through apps, for example, in South Africa, but that's not necessarily the case in all African markets. So, how do you sort of market to customers and explain what you do, and how do you get them to download the app, or is it a website for the first time? And that's different in different markets. Do people, browse online and use Google a lot, like in South Africa, or in a market like Kenya? Do you need to pay more attention to above the line marketing and where people spend a lot of time in traffic? You've got to think about, radio or billboards. And then, of course, COVID has also dented that and sort of changed that whole picture, because if you're not going to the office and you're relying on marketing to people through radio, that throws a bit of a spanner in the works. So it's been a real learning experience and baptism of fire. And there've definitely been challenges and some failures in how we've launched and executed in the different markets. A good example is also just thinking about Kenya and payments. And, in South Africa, a large portion of bookings will be through card. We also have other options for sort of postpaid through EFT or whatever the case is. But the vast majority of customers will have some sort of card that they can just load onto the platform, and it's very seamless. And in Kenya, if you're not offering M-Pesa, for example, as a payment option, you're cutting into a significant amount of your addressable market. And then in a market like Egypt, cash on delivery is still really big. And so you've got to cater for that. And then, that also changes the logistics around how things work.
You can't make the assumption when you start a platform business that everybody works in the same way. You deliver a service, you get paid. It's nice and simple. You've got your card details loaded onto an application. Every time you make a booking, the payment is made. Ka-ching, ka-ching. No money changes hands. No animals are hurt in the process. And it's really seamless. Suddenly, this has seams, this has fault lines, this has complexity attached to it. It's no longer as clear and simple as perhaps the original vision may have been.
Yeah, and I think, that's part of being an entrepreneur. And I think part of being an entrepreneur in markets that are, on the one hand, less sort of seamless across the board infrastructure. So if you think about Europe or the US, there's a lot more relative homogeneity in terms of, this is the experience that most people in this market will have. Whereas I think across the continent, you have big differences across markets that do make it more challenging. I think that's an opportunity. And I think the big opportunity with entrepreneurs who are building on the African continent is that you have the chance to be part of dictating what that basic infrastructure looks like and being part of that process. But it does definitely make things a lot more difficult. And so, yes, it's work, but I think, the horizon in terms of how fast you're able to grow and how many challenges you're expecting to have to address that are adjacent and not necessarily like exactly along the line of, the company's growth and how you're expecting to grow from a straight bookings or top line or revenue sort of performance point of view. It does hinder that. And on the other hand, I've been grateful that we haven't known about a lot of these things, because it's, sometimes ignorance is bliss, and you'll deal with it when you come across it. So I think it's a mix of eyes open, but also,
Robbie Rosen said the same thing. He said, you've got to be naive. You've actually got to be a bit stupid to go and do
Yeah.
what they've done and expanding to 35 different countries in the same way as you've expanded into new markets. Because if you do know the complexity and the difficulty and the hazards of many of these things, you simply don't do it because actually it's too flipping hard. But once you're in it, you've got no choice. You've got to sink or swim.
So I think it's a fallacy that entrepreneurs are people who love taking risks. But I think we are a lot more comfortable with taking calculated risks. And I think where calculated comes in is going, there are things that I don't know. How confident am I that when I come across those things that I don't know, I'm going to be able to work through them? You don't sort of have your eyes completely closed, but you go, I know that there are going to be risks, and how equipped do I feel as a person, as someone who's building a team to tackle those things.
And being the person, of course, who has to have the solutions to the problems, because there will be problems, and somehow you have teams that expect you to know the answers, and you don't, frankly. How do you cope when you get to a solution when you simply don't know the answer?
Yeah, I think it's something that you have to learn to navigate. And I think, firstly, just as this personality type that I think a lot of entrepreneurs tend to have, is you want to solve things yourself and you want to be the person who is executing and who's charging through. And then you inevitably will get to a point where you can't do that anymore because you can't know everything. And also because, particularly as a first-time founder, you're experiencing a lot of these challenges for the first time. And, you just get to this point where sort of your rate of growth and the business rate of growth can start running apart a little bit. And so it's not true that you have to be the person who solves everything. And I think as you scale, the team members that you bring on board, the investors that you bring on board, the advisors that you have, mentors, become increasingly important. And sometimes it's even just to say, yeah, like you're not really there in terms of the solution, but that's normal, and and that's okay, and you'll get there. But I certainly have lost the notion a long time ago that like I need to, or even should be, the person with all the answers. We've had the benefit of working with incredible people as part of the SweepSouth team, and also just had really, really great investors come on board who've been just great in terms of experience, but also just super aligned in terms of understanding how difficult this challenge is, and bringing on board their own expertise and that of their networks to just help solve it.
Coming up on Bruce Whitfield's Genius Podcast.
I guess there's a bit of sourness with some of the earlier stage South African investors who passed, because, even the thinking, that we've gotten too expensive or that they'd missed the chance, we've multiplied between rounds investors' return on the capital that they invested in the previous round with every single round.
What defines genius? A brilliant mind? Unsurpassed ambition? Perhaps. Lexus believes it's about something different. Authenticity. This lies in the ability to follow that one thing that drives you, that one true part of who you are. That is the root of genius. And that's the authenticity you experience when you're behind the wheel of a Lexus. It's just one way that Lexus makes luxury personal. Book a test drive at your nearest Lexus dealer and experience amazing. Talk to me about capital and raising capital. You famously bootstrapped the business with very little. You moved back home with your mum and dad. The last thing they were expecting was to have you and Alan arrive on their doorstep with two small kids saying, that PhD I did in human genetics and that business degree, well, we're going to use the business degree part of it. And Alan's got coding skills, and that's fine, except we can't afford to live by ourselves anymore. So we're moving in here. Mum, of course, is a very senior government official. Dad is a businessman with many years of experience. You move back home and you start hustling, and you start entering competitions, and you start winning prizes, and that provides you with some funding. You also go through various funding rounds as you become bigger and more professional in your approach. What strikes me as really quite tragic is that you're not raising capital in South Africa. You're raising quite a lot of foreign capital. You're raising quite a lot of American capital. You come to the attention of various sort of family offices outside of South Africa. Was it deliberate on your part, or was it just a really difficult sell in your home market?
So, we've raised a combination of South African capital and international, and primarily, in the case of international, US-based. I think definitely had wanted to strike a balance between South African investors who understand this space and how it relates to emerging markets and the opportunity, so South African/African, and then also international investors who have a lot more in terms of time and exposure, experience with just, venture capital as an asset class, and, and setting up funds and thinking about how to structure deals. And so it's been good having that balance. So we, for example, when we signed our first Safe Note, which is a funding instrument, I think we were the first South African company to use a safe convertible note to fund the business. And so there were a lot of firsts, when we started back in 2014. And part of that, again, was driven by having this influence of international investors to complement the South African investors that we were bringing on board. But I think it's important to have a diverse investor base and sort of use them not just as investors, but also the networks that they're able to tap into. And unfortunately, also as we've grown, and I can see the ecosystem, the VC ecosystem on the continent, really growing and maturing. But as we've grown, it's also been more difficult to attract the sort of quantum of funding that we've needed for our next stage from just purely South African or African investors.
I talked to VCs. You like the fish that got away. And I think, like most fishing stories, the fish gets bigger every time I ask about why you didn't get huge support. And I think there was some skepticism as to whether or not you truly could revolutionize an industry. And I think there was also a sense that by the time people realized that you were onto something, you were then too big and expensive to back for many South African VCs. And so you had to go international. Susan and Michael Dell have been very good about investing, and you had Nussbats when they were doing that sort of thing through the Foundry. You were a showcase investment of theirs. And so there's been a huge amount of success. And people have bought into the Africa vision. And the last time we chatted, you were saying we're eyeing Latin America. The structures of societies are not dissimilar. There is potentially an opportunity, and you have been spending a lot more time in the United States, and I guess that's where the money is, and it's easier to access Latin America out of the United States. Then you've been spending a bit more time there assessing new markets and new opportunities. What have you found?
Firstly, to say about investors, so during SweepSouth's last funding round, brought on Alethea IDF, who are a fund based between Nigeria and South Africa, and who have been just incredible. So impact focused, gender lens focused. They raised $100 million fund on the continent. Again, you're seeing this really great activity with really high quality, high caliber investors on the continent. And so that's changed over time. And I think the funny thing is, and I guess there's a bit of sourness with some of the earlier stage South African investors who passed, because even the thinking, that we've gotten too expensive or that they'd missed the chance, we've multiplied between rounds investors' return on the capital that they invested in the previous round with every single round that we've raised. And so, I think with African investors, firstly, there are investors who are active and who invest at later stages. And again, Alethea IDF is a great example of that. And Polo Radebe has been wonderful. But there are opportunities, right, on the continent. And I think this sort of notion that when companies get too big, Europe or the US is where they have to look, I think that's becoming less and less true, and thankfully so. But yeah, it's definitely looking sort of beyond South Africa. I think a Latin America and emerging markets outside of Africa in general being really interesting. I think something that we've sort of had to bear in mind from a market exposure point of view is just, where the world is going and how, unfortunately, unshielded a lot of these markets are to just turbulence in macroeconomic markets. And so I think it's always a balance between what makes a market interesting and sort of what are the sort of internal influences that could potentially make it interesting from a return point of view, but also potential risk in those markets and what's happening at a more macro level.
Fools go where angels fear to tread. We look at Argentina's inflation problem running at over 100% at the moment. You don't go into an environment like that and invest in a hurry. I think we're waiting to see how Brazil under new management pans out. And so are you actively pursuing opportunities in those markets, or are you watching and waiting?
I think it's a watching and waiting. And I think, we're also overall re-looking at strategy. I think, what's important for us is there's the growth element, and then there is also the impact element. And I think, even within more quote unquote economically developed markets, there's still both growth opportunity and also the opportunity to make an impact. I think, workers in many more developed markets who are part of this industry still face the issues that African and Latin American domestic workers, nannies, home service providers face. So it's a wait and see, but I think also looking at the broader opportunity a little bit differently.
Meaning what? You can't drop a clanger like that and say, hold on a second, don't expect a follow-up question. What do you mean the broader opportunity slightly differently?
In our view, maybe SweepSouth is looking at more developed markets as well. Maybe a European launch, a US launch, or something that's on the cards. And I think from an impact point of view, which is really important to us, I think a lot of these challenges still exist, and you have a lot of migrant workers doing this sort of work who don't have the same protections as citizens, who are not paid well. And so, I think that's something that's interesting for us to at least explore.
And I mean, funders, how are they looking at the opportunity? I mean, SAB Miller, of course, famously went into emerging markets, and gradually, as they were more exposed to corporate funding and to market funding, they needed to give investors hope, and they ended up investing in Miller in the United States, and they ended up in buying Peroni and Foster's and many other brands, of course, over time as well. And that's also to give, I suppose, an assurance to funders that you're not just an emerging markets play, that there is a hard currency element potential here for the future.
And that becomes potentially important. I think SweepSouth is in a good position where there was a fundraise that was closed mid last year.
$14 million.
So in terms of a little bit of cash in the bank and dry gunpowder, the business is in a comfortable position. But I think, looking at what opportunities exist in terms of what's on the ground in some of these markets is definitely going to be part of that evaluation of those markets.
You're approaching a 10-year anniversary. You look back at the last decade, what is your sort of key learning during that period? Don't ever go into business for yourself, or actually this is the best thing we could ever have done?
I mean, in general, depending on your personality and if this is for you, the journey of entrepreneurship is the most exciting but also most scary thing I've ever done in my life. And it's an incredible way to learn about yourself and really be faced with the reality of the things that you are good at and can count on yourself for and can be counted on for, but also the things that you need to work on. And so I think approaching 10 years, just feeling incredibly grateful, like that our lives have taken this turn and we've been able to experience having an idea and then building it into something tangible, and being able to do that with the support of incredible people. SweepSouth has a wonderful team. The first employee who joined the company is the MD of the company and is just an absolute force within the business. And to see the growth of people like that and their growth in terms of role and prominence within the business has been awesome. And in the impact part as well. And to again say that, whatever happens, you've impacted tens of thousands of women who in turn will, in their families and communities, have impacted hundreds of thousands. I think as founders to sort of reflect back on that it's a lot. It's incredible.
There's a huge amount of satisfaction that comes with that. Yet, unless you are the founder of Patagonia, who, when he discovered he'd become a billionaire by virtue of the fact that people just loved the products that he made and the marketing and the story behind Patagonia, he got to become dollar billionaire, became terribly embarrassed and gave the company to a trust to fight climate change, because that's his true passion project at the end of his working career, and his family agreed that he should do it. Everybody wants to be financially successful. Is this a business that is one that will satisfy the Aisha Pandor household's desire for social mobility into the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've also got to be careful building technology businesses not to get into the hype of only thinking that you're successful once you're a billionaire or a unicorn. I think that's, an amazing long-term goal to have. But I think if you use that to define your criteria of being successful, you can lose out on a lot of amazing things that you've done, but also, how much does it take to be financially successful, financially independent? This is something that Alan, not Craig Jr., actually said to me quite early on in our journey with SweepSouth, is just don't become tricked into constantly working towards this goal that is potentially very far away, to the detriment of having your feet on the ground and seeing what you're building and the benefit of what you're building. So I think, in terms of the value of the business, it's probably overall, it's well past can you become long-term financially independent from this. I think what we're really focused on now is like, how do you continue to build value? How do you do it in a way where where you're having fun, how do you equip the team to be a big part of that? Because after 10 years, you also are tired and have thought through a lot of things. And, so fresh blood is something that we're thinking about. And then again, impact, and I think at the end of the day, and you use Patagonia as an example, it's also about running a business that positively impacts people. And I think for me, that's far more gratifying, both after doing this for 10 years, but also just based on, my background and who my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents are. I think it's way more important to say, have you done something that adds value, that people care about, that's made the world a better place, the people who engage with your business.
Still school fees. There's still, life still has to happen. Is it still exciting you in the way that it did on that first evening where you caught the lift cab with the magic of this device? And smartphones were fairly new back then. And suddenly the possibility of what these devices could do from a social perspective dawned upon you. Is it still exciting?
I think what's exciting is seeing what's happening in technology in the rest of the world and thinking about how that grows markets in total, and then thinking about how that can be applied to businesses like SweepSouth, but just in general. I mean, I'm really passionate about technology and progress on the African continent and entrepreneurs who are building things. So what's really exciting is thinking about what's the next phase of that? And again, how do you build value into growing into things like digital currencies and financial services? And, how do you think about the benefits of machine learning and AI and how they apply to these models? And that makes it exciting, is kind of, looking at progress and traction in the rest of the world and how that can apply to just growing this business, this industry.
Yeah, you got to be thinking expansively, don't you? You can't be trapped within a framework. There are going to be...
Well, the world changes, exactly, and it changes quickly, and the world of technology changes incredibly quickly. I mean, I was looking at the shift from the thinking around kind of cryptocurrency and then the metaverse and then AI, and things shift, and that's not a bad thing. Sometimes there's sort of criticism about how fickle people in this industry can be, and you sort of jump from one thing to the next. But I think that's completely appropriate. That's how you sort of drive progress and think about the utility of new technologies and innovation. So it's incredibly exciting. I think, I'm really just excited about everything that's happening and the potential that it has to benefit a whole lot of industries on the African continent, but also this new wave of young entrepreneurs who are going to be building off the back of these technologies.
That is Aisha Pandor, the co-founder of SweepSouth, with husband Alan Ribbick.
Bruce Whitfield's Genius Podcast in partnership with Lexus. Subscribe now to your favorite podcast app.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember, you can see me experience amazing in the brand new Lexus RX 350 by clicking on the link in the blurb of this episode. Go on. You know you want to.